Sarah Martinez had never held a real gun before the day she walked onto the military training grounds at Fort Benning. The weight of the M16 rifle felt foreign in her small hands, and the smell of gunpowder from the firing range made her nose wrinkle. At 19 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, with nervous brown eyes that darted around the intimidating training facility. The other recruits towered over her, most of them men who had grown up hunting with their fathers or shooting at local ranges. They carried themselves with a confidence that Sarah desperately wished she possessed. When Drill Sergeant Michael Rodriguez first laid eyes on her during weapons training orientation, his weathered face immediately showed disapproval. "Great, another one who probably thinks guns are evil," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for several nearby recruits to hear and snicker. Sarah had joined the military for reasons that had nothing to do with wanting to shoot things. Her family had struggled financially for years after her father lost his job at the local factory. The military offered her a path to education, health care, and a stable future. She was determined to succeed, but firearms training felt like an insurmountable obstacle. The first day on the shooting range was a disaster. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to line up her sights with the target 50 meters away. The rifle felt impossibly heavy, and every time she pulled the trigger, the recoil jolted through her entire body. Her shots went wide, missing the large paper target completely and hitting the dirt berm behind it. Sergeant Rodriguez walked behind the firing line, observing each recruit's performance. When he reached Sarah's position, he stopped and shook his head dramatically. "Martinez, what exactly are you aiming at? The clouds? Maybe trying to shoot down a passing airplane?" The other recruits chuckled, and Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She had always been a perfectionist in school, earning top grades and excelling in everything she attempted. This public failure felt devastating. "I am sorry, Sergeant. I'm trying my best," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sounds of gunfire from other positions. "Your best isn't good enough if it can't hit a barn door from 10 feet away," Rodriguez replied harshly. "Maybe you should have considered a different career path. The military isn't a place for people who can't handle weapons." That evening in the barracks, Sarah lay on her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling. Her bunkmate, Jessica, tried to offer encouragement, but Sarah felt utterly defeated. She had never quit anything in her life, but the sergeant's words echoed in her mind. Maybe she really wasn't cut out for military life. The next morning brought another round of weapons training. This time, Sarah approached one of the veteran soldiers who worked as an assistant instructor. Private First Class David Chun had been watching her struggles with interest rather than amusement. "I noticed you're having trouble with your stance," he said kindly during the break. "Mind if I show you something?" Chun spent 15 minutes working with Sarah on the fundamentals that the drill sergeant had rushed through during the initial instruction. He showed her how to properly shoulder the weapon, how to control her breathing, and how to squeeze the trigger smoothly rather than jerking it. "The rifle doesn't want to hurt you," Chun explained. "It's a tool, just like a hammer or a screwdriver. Respect it, understand it, and it will work with you instead of against you." For the first time since arriving at basic training, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Chen's patient instruction was completely different from Sergeant Rodriguez's intimidating approach. She began to understand that marksmanship was as much mental as physical. When the afternoon shooting session began, Sarah tried to apply everything Chun had taught her. Her first shot still missed the target, but it hit the wooden frame instead of sailing into the dirt. The second shot actually touched the edge of the paper target. Sergeant Rodriguez noticed her slight improvement, but wasn't impressed. "Well, look at that. Martinez actually hit something. Too bad it wasn't anywhere near where she was supposed to be aiming." Despite the sarcasm, Sarah felt encouraged. Any progress was better than complete failure. She continued practicing every chance she got, even volunteering for extra shooting sessions on weekends when other recruits were relaxing. The training schedule was relentless. Every day brought new challenges beyond marksmanship. Physical fitness tests, classroom instruction on military history, and protocols field exercises that left everyone exhausted and covered in mud. But Sarah found herself thinking about shooting even during other activities. She visualized the process John had taught her, mentally rehearsing the steps over and over. 3 weeks into basic training, Sarah's shooting had improved enough that she was hitting the target consistently, though still not scoring well. She was grouped with the other struggling shooters for additional instruction, which meant more time with Sergeant Rodriguez and more opportunities for his cutting remarks. "I've seen kindergartners with better hand-eye coordination," he told her after a particularly frustrating session where her shots were scattered all over the target. "Maybe you should ask for a transfer to the mess hall. At least there you can't hurt anyone except with bad cooking." The constant criticism was wearing her down, but Sarah noticed something important. Rodriguez spent more time correcting her technique than he did with recruits who were already shooting well. His methods were harsh and discouraging, but underneath the insults, he was actually teaching her. She began paying closer attention to his technical feedback while trying to ignore the personal attacks. When he told her that her trigger finger placement was wrong, she adjusted it. When he corrected her breathing pattern, she practiced it until it became automatic. Slowly, very slowly, her accuracy began to improve. One evening, Sarah was cleaning her rifle in the barracks when she overheard 2 other recruits talking about Sergeant Rodriguez. "My older brother went through training here 5 years ago," one of them said. "He told me Rodriguez is actually one of the best marksmanship instructors in the Army. Says he only gives people a hard time if he thinks they have potential." Sarah wondered if this could possibly be true. It seemed impossible that the sergeant saw any potential in her when he spent so much time pointing out her failures. But the thought gave her a new perspective on his harsh treatment. The next day brought a significant milestone. For the first time, Sarah managed to get 3 shots in a row within the scoring rings of the target. They weren't perfect shots, and they weren't grouped tightly together, but they were legitimate hits in the area that would count for points. Sergeant Rodriguez examined her target and nodded slightly. "Not terrible, Martinez. Still nowhere near good enough to qualify, but at least you're not completely hopeless anymore." Coming from him, this qualified as high praise. Sarah felt a surge of confidence that carried her through the rest of the day's training. That evening, she wrote a letter home to her parents, telling them about her gradual progress and her determination to succeed. As the weeks passed, Sarah's improvement accelerated. Her shots began grouping more tightly, and she started understanding the subtle factors that affected accuracy: wind direction, lighting conditions, even the way she gripped the rifle. She developed a pre-shot routine that helped her focus and stay calm under pressure. The other recruits began to notice her progress. Some offered encouragement, while others seemed surprised that the small, quiet girl who had started so poorly was becoming genuinely competent with her weapon. Sarah appreciated the support, but tried not to let it go to her head. She knew she still had a long way to go. Sergeant Rodriguez's attitude toward her began to shift as well, though he maintained his gruff exterior. His criticism became more technical and less personal. Instead of mocking her failures, he started pointing out specific things she could do to improve. Sarah realized that this change probably meant she was approaching the minimum standards required for graduation from basic training. The qualification test loomed ahead like a final exam that would determine her military future. Every recruit had to demonstrate proficiency with their weapon to continue in the service. Sarah knew that all her hard work would ultimately be measured by her performance on that single day. She had come so far from the terrified teenager who couldn't hit a target at 50 meters, but she also knew that Sergeant Rodriguez was right about one thing. In the military, good enough to pass was barely adequate. Real proficiency required excellence, and Sarah was determined to achieve it. The weeks leading up to qualification testing transformed Sarah's entire approach to marksmanship. What had once felt like an impossible task now became an obsession with precision and consistency. She studied ballistics manuals during her free time, learning about bullet trajectory, wind drift, and the subtle science behind accurate shooting. Private Chun continued to mentor her whenever possible, though their training sessions had to be discreet to avoid undermining Sergeant Rodriguez's authority. During equipment maintenance periods, Chin would quietly share advanced techniques that weren't covered in the standard curriculum. The difference between a good shooter and a great shooter isn't natural talent, he explained while they cleaned their rifles together. It's understanding that every shot is affected by dozens of variables. Temperature, humidity, your heart rate, even what you ate for breakfast. Great shooters learn to control what they can and compensate for what they can't. Sarah absorbed every piece of advice like a student preparing for the most important exam of her life. She began keeping a shooting journal, recording details about each practice session, weather conditions, her physical state, what techniques worked best that day, and areas where she still struggled. Her fellow recruits started seeking her advice, which surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. Marcus Thompson, a recruit from rural Alabama who had been hunting since childhood, asked her about breathing techniques after watching her consistent performance during a windy practice session. "I never thought about coordinating my breathing with my heart rate," he admitted. "You make it look automatic now." Sarah realized that her analytical approach to learning marksmanship was helping other recruits who had relied purely on instinct. She started sharing techniques during informal study groups, explaining the mental aspects of shooting that complemented natural athletic ability. Sergeant Rodriguez observed these developments without comment, but Sarah noticed his attention during her practice sessions had intensified. He would stand behind her position for longer periods, watching her pre-shot routine and analyzing her technique with obvious interest. One afternoon during advanced marksmanship training, the sergeant introduced a new challenge, engaging multiple targets at varying distances under time pressure. This exercise simulated combat conditions where speed and accuracy were equally important. "This separates the real shooters from the lucky amateurs," Rodriguez announced. "You'll have 30 seconds to engage 5 targets at distances from 25 to 300 meters. Miss any target, and you fail the exercise." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Timed exercises had always been her weakness because she tended to overthink each shot. But she remembered Chin's advice about trusting her training and letting muscle memory take over. When her turn came, Sarah approached the firing line with deliberate calm. She had practiced this scenario dozens of times in her mind, visualizing the sequence of movements required to transition between targets efficiently. The timer started, and Sarah engaged the first target at 25 meters. The close-range shot was easy, and she moved immediately to the 50-meter target. Her breathing was controlled, her movements fluid. The 100-meter target required a slight adjustment for bullet drop, which she made instinctively. Time was running short as she transitioned to the 200-meter target. This distance required careful attention to wind conditions and precise sight alignment. Sarah took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot felt perfect as it left the barrel. With only seconds remaining, she swung to the final target at 300 meters. This was the most challenging shot, requiring compensation for significant bullet drop and wind drift. There was no time for second-guessing. Sarah aligned her sights, made her corrections, and fired just as the timer reached 0. All 5 targets showed clean hits within the scoring zones. Sarah had completed the exercise faster than most of the more experienced shooters, and her accuracy was flawless. The range fell silent as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Sergeant Rodriguez walked to Sarah's position and examined her targets carefully. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see something different in his eyes. For the first time since training began, he looked at her with what might have been respect. "Acceptable performance, Martinez," he said quietly, then raised his voice for the other recruits to hear. "This is what happens when someone decides to take training seriously instead of making excuses." That evening, word of Sarah's performance spread throughout the barracks. Recruits who had initially dismissed her as weak or incapable now looked at her with new interest. Some asked for shooting tips, while others simply wanted to understand how someone could improve so dramatically in such a short time. Jessica, her bunkmate, was amazed by the transformation she had witnessed. "I remember that first day when you couldn't hit anything," she said. "Now you're shooting better than guys who've been hunting their whole lives. How did you do it?" Sarah thought about the question seriously before answering. "I think it was because I had to learn everything from scratch. I couldn't rely on habits that might be wrong. Every technique I learned was deliberate and practiced until it became automatic." The qualification test was scheduled for the following week, and Sarah felt more confident than ever before. She had proven to herself and others that she could perform under pressure. But she also knew that Sergeant Rodriguez would be watching her performance with special attention. During the final practice session before qualification, Rodriguez pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. They walked to an empty section of the range where they could talk without being overheard by other recruits. "I'm going to tell you something that doesn't leave this range," the sergeant said, his usual harsh tone replaced by something more serious. "When you first arrived here, I figured you'd wash out within 2 weeks. Thought you were another college kid who joined the military because it sounded like an adventure." Sarah listened silently, unsure whether this conversation would end with praise or criticism. "I was wrong," Rodriguez continued. "You've worked harder than any recruit I've trained in the past 5 years. More importantly, you've shown other soldiers that improvement is possible if someone is willing to put in the effort." He paused, looking out across the empty range. "Tomorrow's qualification isn't just about meeting minimum standards for you. Other recruits are watching to see if all that work was worth it. Some of them are struggling with their own challenges, and they need to see that success is possible." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders. She had been focused on her own performance, but now she understood that her success or failure would affect other people's confidence and motivation. "I want you to know that regardless of what happens tomorrow, you've already exceeded my expectations," Rodriguez said. "But I also want you to understand that qualifying is just the beginning. The real test comes when you're serving in the field, where precision and reliability can mean the difference between life and death." That night, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been a frightened teenager who couldn't hit a target from 50 meters. Now she was being treated as an example for other soldiers to follow. She thought about her family back home, who had no idea how much she had struggled and grown during basic training. They knew she was learning to shoot, but they couldn't understand the personal transformation that had occurred alongside her technical improvement. The morning of qualification dawned clear and still, with perfect conditions for shooting. Sarah felt calm and focused as she prepared her equipment and reviewed her mental checklist one final time. The techniques that had once felt awkward and unnatural now felt as comfortable as walking. During breakfast, several recruits approached her with nervous questions about the test. Sarah offered encouragement and reminded them to trust their training, the same advice that Chun had given her weeks earlier. "Remember," she told Marcus Thompson, who was still struggling with consistency despite his hunting background, "every shot is independent. If you miss one, don't let it affect the next one. Focus on the process, not the outcome." As the recruits assembled at the firing line for qualification testing, Sarah noticed that Sergeant Rodriguez was paying particular attention to her final preparations. She wondered if he was hoping she would succeed or expecting her to fail under the pressure of the official test. The qualification course required 40 shots at targets ranging from 50 to 300 meters, with different positions and time limits for each stage. Sarah would need to score at least 32 hits within the scoring rings to pass, but she had set a higher standard for herself. Standing at the firing line with her rifle ready and her mind clear, Sarah felt a sense of completion. Regardless of what happened in the next hour, she had already accomplished something important. She had proven to herself that determination and hard work could overcome any initial disadvantage. The qualification range buzzed with nervous energy as 40 recruits prepared for the test, that would determine their military futures. Sarah Martinez stood at firing position 12, her M16 rifle slung across her shoulder, feeling remarkably calm despite the magnitude of the moment. The transformation from the terrified teenager who had missed entire targets just weeks ago seemed almost impossible to believe. Sergeant Rodriguez addressed the entire group with his characteristic stern demeanor. Today separates those who belong in the United States Army from those who should find different careers. There are no participation trophies here. You either meet the standard or you fail. His eyes briefly met Sarah's, and she saw something unexpected there. It wasn't encouragement exactly, but it wasn't the dismissive contempt she had grown accustomed to either. Rodriguez seemed genuinely curious about her performance, as if he himself wasn't certain what would happen. The first stage required 10 shots from the prone supported position at 50 meters. This was considered the easiest part of the qualification, designed to build confidence before moving to more challenging distances and positions. Sarah settled into her firing position, remembering every detail of the technique she had practiced hundreds of times. Her first shot hit the center ring of the target, earning maximum points. The second shot grouped closely with the first, followed by 8 more shots that created a tight cluster well within the scoring area. Sarah had achieved a perfect score on the opening stage, something that even experienced shooters didn't always accomplish. Other recruits glanced over at her target with obvious surprise. Marcus Thompson, shooting from the adjacent position, shook his head in amazement. "I can't believe that's the same person who couldn't hit anything 6 weeks ago," he whispered to his neighbor. The second stage moved to the prone, unsupported position at 100 meters, eliminating the artificial stability of sandbags and bipods. Sarah adjusted her position carefully, using her non-firing hand to create a stable platform for the rifle. Her shots remained tightly grouped, earning 9 out of 10 possible points. Sergeant Rodriguez walked behind the firing line, examining each recruit's performance. When he reached Sarah's position, he stopped and studied her target through his binoculars. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed he spent more time analyzing her shots than he had for other recruits. The third stage presented the first real challenge: 10 shots from the sitting position at 200 meters. This position required greater muscular control and balance, and the increased distance magnified any errors in technique. Sarah had struggled with this stage during practice, but her recent improvement gave her confidence. She settled into the sitting position, wrapping her arm through the rifle sling for additional stability. The target seemed impossibly small at 200 meters, barely visible even through her rifle's iron sights. Sarah controlled her breathing, aligned her sights carefully, and began engaging the target with deliberate precision. Her first shot hit slightly low and to the left, still within the scoring rings, but not where she had intended. Instead of panicking or overthinking the error, Sarah made a small adjustment and continued firing. The remaining 9 shots grouped tightly in the center of the target, demonstrating the mental discipline she had developed over weeks of intensive training. The fourth stage increased the pressure significantly. 10 shots from the kneeling position at 250 meters, with a strict time limit that forced shooters to balance speed with accuracy. Sarah had watched several strong shooters fail this stage during practice sessions when they either rushed their shots and missed targets or took too much time and couldn't complete the course of fire. As she moved into the kneeling position, Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. This was normal and expected, but it required her to adjust her breathing pattern to maintain accuracy. She had learned to use her elevated heart rate as a timing mechanism, firing during the natural pause between heartbeats when her body was most stable. The timer started, and Sarah began engaging the target with smooth, consistent rhythm. She had practiced this stage enough to know exactly how much time each shot required, allowing her to maintain accuracy while completing the course of fire within the time limit. All 10 shots landed within the scoring rings, with 8 of them grouped in the center section for maximum points. Other recruits were beginning to notice Sarah's exceptional performance. During the brief break between stages, Several came over to examine her targets. Even those who had initially been skeptical of her abilities now looked at her with obvious respect. "How are you staying so calm?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a recruit from Nevada who had been struggling with test anxiety. "I'm so nervous I can barely hold my rifle steady." Sarah thought about the question before answering. "I think it helps that I had to work so hard just to get to this point. Every shot I'm taking now is better than anything I could do when I started. That makes it easier to stay focused on the process instead of worrying about the results." The final stage represented the ultimate test of marksmanship skills. 10 shots from the standing position at 300 meters, with no artificial support and a challenging time limit. This stage had the highest failure rate because it required the combination of all fundamental skills: stability, sight alignment, trigger control, breathing, and mental focus. Standing at the 300-meter line, Sarah could barely see her target even when she squinted. The standing position offered no stability beyond what she could create with her own body, and the distance meant that any small error would be magnified significantly. Many experienced shooters considered this stage more difficult than combat shooting because it required such precise technical execution. Sarah assumed her standing position, remembering the countless hours she had spent practicing this exact scenario. She created a stable platform by locking her support elbow against her ribcage and distributing her weight evenly between both feet. Her breathing became deep and regular as she prepared for the most challenging shots of the qualification. The timer started for the final stage. Sarah raised her rifle, aligned her sights on the barely visible target, and began the careful process of engaging each shot. The distance made feedback impossible. She couldn't see where her bullets were hitting until the course of fire was complete, and the targets were retrieved for scoring. Each shot felt perfect as it left the barrel, but Sarah knew that feeling could be deceiving. She had experienced sessions where shots that felt perfect missed the target completely, while shots that felt rushed or awkward somehow found their mark. All she could do was trust her training and execute each shot with the same careful technique she had practiced. When the final shot was fired, Sarah lowered her rifle and waited for the targets to be retrieved. The range fell silent except for the distant sound of the target carriers moving downrange to collect the results. This moment of waiting always felt longer than the actual shooting. Sergeant Rodriguez personally retrieved Sarah's target from the 300-meter line. As he walked back toward the firing line, his expression gave no indication of what he had found. Sarah watched his face carefully, trying to read any sign of disappointment or approval. When Rodriguez reached the firing line, he held up Sarah's target for everyone to see. All 10 shots had hit within the scoring rings, with 9 of them grouped tightly in the center section. The pattern was so precise it looked almost artificial, as if it had been created by a machine rather than a human shooter. The range erupted in surprise comments and congratulations from other recruits. Even the assistant instructors gathered around to examine the target more closely. Sarah had not only qualified for military service, she had achieved one of the highest scores anyone could remember seeing from a basic training student. 40 out of 40 possible points, Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying across the range. Perfect qualification score. Sarah felt a wave of emotion that she hadn't expected. Relief, pride, accomplishment, and gratitude all mixed together in a moment that would define her military career. She had not only overcome her initial failures, but had achieved excellence that exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. Rodriguez approached her privately while other recruits were completing their qualification attempts. "I owe you an apology, Martinez," he said quietly. "When you first arrived, I thought you were just another recruit who would waste everyone's time before dropping out. I was wrong about your potential and wrong about your character." He paused, looking at her target again. "More importantly, you've shown every other recruit on this range that improvement is possible regardless of where someone starts. That's a valuable lesson that goes far beyond marksmanship." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but managed to maintain her composure. "Thank you, Sergeant." Your tough standards push me to work harder than I ever thought possible. The real test starts now, Rodriguez replied. Qualifying is just the beginning. The Army needs soldiers who can perform when lives depend on it, not just when everything is perfect on a training range. As the qualification session concluded, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had learned far more than just how to shoot accurately. The process had taught her about persistence, mental discipline, the value of expert instruction, and the importance of maintaining standards even when they seemed impossibly high. Private Chin approached her as the group prepared to leave the range. I knew you had it in you from the beginning, he said with a smile. You just needed to discover it yourself. That evening, Sarah wrote a long letter to her parents describing her qualification results. She tried to explain not just what she had accomplished, but how the experience had changed her understanding of her own capabilities. The scared teenager who had entered basic training had become a confident soldier ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Word of Sarah's perfect qualification score spread quickly throughout the training battalion. She became something of a legend among struggling recruits who needed proof that dramatic improvement was possible. Instructors began using her story as an example of what could be achieved through dedication and proper training methods. Years later, when Sarah had become an instructor herself, she would think back to that qualification day as the moment when she truly understood what it meant to be a soldier. Excellence wasn't about natural talent or lucky breaks. It was about refusing to accept limitations, learning from experts, and maintaining standards even when the pressure was overwhelming. The drill instructor who had once scoffed at her failures had taught her the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes the harshest critics become the strongest advocates when someone proves worthy of their respect.